Hello, I'm Shiva Rajgopal, the Kester and Byrnes Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Lisa Sachs. Welcome, Lisa. Maybe you can introduce yourself, and then we can start with a few thoughts about impact, risk, and so on.
Thank you so much, Shiva. I always love speaking with you and learning from you. I am the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia Climate School, where I'm also on the faculty, and I'm the director of our brand new MS in Climate Finance, which we've launched this year and will start this fall. And maybe just to say one thing about the orientation with which I come to this discussion, my work personally and the work that I have led at CCSI for 16 years is on how to achieve the sustainable development transformations and including climate change mitigation, but across all of the sustainable development goals by really trying to understand what investments are needed, what reforms are needed, what are the challenges and the barriers that need to be addressed, and then what are the solutions across technology, policy, finance, practices that can drive those transitions. And we do very applied work. So we work very much with governments, with financial institutions, with international institutions, and with companies to try to drive pragmatic but ambitious reforms that are really needed to achieve our global goals.
So we've had so many interesting coffees and lunches, many, many hours. Most of the time it's productive. Some of it may or may not be productive. But if you were to distill all that, maybe in 10 odd minutes for our audience, what would you say? And most of our audience, as you can imagine, are accountants, academics, policymakers. Not that different from maybe your audience, except with a slight emphasis maybe on accounting academics and practitioners.
Well, there are many reasons I enjoy speaking with you, but learning from the accountant perspective and how to think about the role of accountants in these transformations is one of the main things I've really learned from you and have thought about because first of all, because what we measure defines and how we assign responsibility defines how we progress. It defines what is incentivized, what is rewarded, and ultimately, therefore, where capital flows. And that, therefore, is absolutely critical for the work that I do. And why we have had so many engaged discussions, maybe without resolution, is that my concern right now is that what we are measuring and our approach to both target setting and the metrics that we've developed are not fit for purpose for the systemic transformations that are needed. And in fact, I think the challenge is getting worse because the landscape of target setting and metrics is expanding and taking us further away, I think, from what needs to be achieved. So maybe I'll summarize, I think, what we have discussed and highlight two central issues that I see in the sustainability ecosystem that are handed to accountants at this point, although I'd like to engage the accountant community to help solve this problem because I think we really need the insights of accountants to think about how we can do differently. But the two basic problems I see that relate to the ecosystem of frameworks for target setting and disclosure and measurement and reporting, which is basically our entire sustainability landscape. And that can be specific to climate or specific to nature or more generally with respect to sustainability goals, I think has two fatal flaws. One is the way it conflates risk and impact, and I'll unpack both of these. And then the second is its overemphasis on entity level actions, target setting, measurement, and reporting when the types of transformations that are needed are systemic, and that the entity level frameworks don't incentivize and may actually disincentivize the types of coordination that are necessary. So let me maybe say two things or unpack each of those because I'd really like to engage all of you in problem solving. I know the problem, I don't have the solution from a accountant perspective. On the risk point, I think that there is one big issue, which is the conflation of risk assessment and risk management with impact, with having impact on whatever risk we're measuring, whether it's climate mitigation, nature preservation, or other sustainability goals. As a general principle, and of course it could be extensively elaborated, but even conceptually to consider that managing impact is absolutely not the same as making proactive investments or taking measures that will achieve impact. And actually, I think the overlap between those two approaches is much smaller than we can imagine. I know that from the impact side, because what it actually takes to achieve transformations are proactive, innovative, collaborative problem solving. And what drives that is policy, whether the markets are right, whether the incentives are there, not a perception of risk. But even if we look at it from the perception of risk, different entities understand risks differently. The scope of risks are different as they relate to any particular financial institution or corporate entity or public regulatory body or community or international institution or government. At each of those levels, they think about risk differently. At the government level, risks are about planetary risk, or at the community level, they're about planetary risk. If you're talking about a financial institution, it's about financial risk. And there, the scope is more limited to the sectors to which they're exposed. The time frame may be longer. So we've written a bit of a brief on this that elaborates on the points I'm making, but the basic point is that different entities understand risk differently. They are exposed to a different set of risks. Of course, there's interconnection among those risks, but they're not the same in scope or time frame. And how different entities consider risk differs too. So for insurance companies, for instance, their role is to price risk and to distribute risk. If you're a financial institution, you might like some risks, or you might hedge against risks, or you might offload risks. But it's rare that, other than a public entity, that any of these institutions consider themselves to have a mandate to actually mitigate the risk. That is rarely the mandate. The mandate is, how do we manage to mitigate our exposure to the risk? So all of that is to say, but let me just say that our whole framework for sustainability measurement and reporting is a lot about risk assessment, assessing exposure to climate risk, assessing exposure to nature risk, reporting on those exposures, reporting on how they're being managed. That's fine and good if what we're concerned about is whether we are managing risks. But that should not be conflated with whether we are actually having an impact on mitigating climate change, on mitigating nature loss or biodiversity loss, and so on. And the problem is that those goals and the metrics have been conflated. So we use those risk measurements and metrics as an indicator of whether we are achieving positive sustainability outcomes. That is massively conflated. So that is one big critique I have with the current landscape. The second is this one I really don't know how to solve, so I need all of your expertise, which is the overemphasis on entity level target setting, measurement, and reporting, when what is really needed to achieve these transformations is necessarily multi-actor, innovative collaboration. We need multi-actor solutions and problem solving to achieve systemic transformations. There are basically two forms of entity level frameworks. One is entity level targets and transition plans. What is the entity purporting to do within its own operations? And the second is footprinting, let's say footprinting from a climate perspective, which is looking at the emissions caused through an entity's own either direct emissions or the emissions from the energy consumed or emissions from the value chain. And the whole framework has looked to the corporate sector to report on those two things, to define entity level pathways and to report on their entity level targets. In reality, what is needed, if you understand systemic transformation, is for a coordinated approach of how do we integrate different types of corporate actors in a value chain with policy, with finance, with utilities, with other institutions to achieve the transformation. So even if these entity level targets were the most robust that they could be, they don't add up to systemic transformation. And there's a limit to what any one entity can do on its own in the absence of this ecosystem. So that is a problem that I'm struggling to solve, because I do think that the entity level emphasis not only does not incentivize this multi-stakeholder collaboration, but it can undermine it. Because, for instance, if a company is operating in a region that has high risks or high emissions, and they can't solve that on their own, if they report high emissions, they'll be pilloried for having high emissions, and it might encourage them to leave a vulnerable region or to leave East Asia that has a high carbon intensity grid, rather than to understand what it takes in a multi-stakeholder context to actually decarbonize those grids or to achieve these broader systemic transformations. So my challenge to all of you, because I don't know the answer, is how to create an accounting framework that might be relevant to individual entities, but that encourages and supports the type of multi-stakeholder, collective and innovative problem solving and transformations that are needed for the systemic transformations that, by the way, I'll end with this point. We know the transformations that are needed by sector, by region. They've been laid out in regional roadmaps, in the net zero by 2050 roadmap that's specific to climate, but we know what needs to be accomplished. And we frankly know how we need to shift the demand pull and the supply pull. We know these things, but we can't solve them if we are just taking a siloed entity level approach to problem solving. So that's what I need better metrics for. How do we encourage and support that type of collaboration? I'll pause there.
So Lisa, I know this is not first best, but I think this came up because the only answer, as you know, is some kind of state governmental intervention. Taxation is the best coordination mechanism, or some kind of policy. And all over the world, as you know, and I know, it's virtually impossible to get a carbon tax passed or to get some kind of coordination done. So people settled on what can I do as opposed to how can I change the system. Perhaps that's what led to the issue that you're discussing. But having said that, let me share a positive story. So I was just talking to a very famous company that you know. Uses plastic to sell its product, and I don't want to reveal the name. And they went to the board and said, look, we want to switch. We want to make HDPE or something, which is apparently slightly better plastic. That's what I've been told. But they didn't have scale. The board said, go find scale. So these guys actually invented the technology and simply gave it away in an effort to create scale with competition in the industry, and hence, by and large, force positive change in the entire industry, which is a fantastic example. And I'm not sure whether I can share the company's name, but that's an example that comes to mind from a positive standpoint on how some kind of, and it doesn't fit the classic profit maximizing framework. So you have to almost frame it as either you'll get some credit, hopefully, for doing these things, and or maybe it'll help your brand in the long run. But, it's hard. You need enlightened companies, you need profits, and you need good management. And otherwise, by and large, these isolated good news cases won't actually happen. But yeah, go on. Let me have you react to that, and then we'll probably switch gears a little bit. Yeah.
Because I don't love the argument that that we can't rely on policy. It's not moving, so we need an entity level thing. Because the reality is that many of these transformations, the constraint is not actually mainly policy. It's that there are structural barriers. It's the lack of enabling infrastructure. It's the lack of integrated thinking about grid design, it's fragmented value chains, it's misaligned finance, it's the high cost of capital in emerging markets. And we're not, by the way, we're not even correctly identifying what the problems are in order to be able to solve them. To give you one example, for instance, with data centers that are high, that need a lot of energy. And right now we're all hand-wringing about how do we have sufficient electricity on the grids to support these data centers, and are they going to take all the energy? What if we could integrate the planning of data centers into grid design and expansion? Then they could anchor the demand for expanded grids for storage solutions. We could use their tech and their AI tools to optimize grid design, to optimize the efficiency of the energy systems, expand digital access, especially in underserved regions. If we were thinking more holistically, we could achieve a lot. And that's not a carbon price thing. That's not a tax thing. That's just bringing together the tech companies with the utilities, the grid planners, and it's a win-win framework for all. It just requires coordinated thinking. But right now, the tech companies are being asked just to report on their emissions. That misses the point entirely of the transformative effect that they could have if we were encouraging a more integrated approach. That's a positive example, hopefully.
Well, I'll just leave you with the question of who's actually going to get that done. But setting that aside, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the MS in climate finance that Columbia launched. Clearly an interesting time to launch a climate degree. More interesting, and I'm hoping to get some advice from you on this. A lot of universities have started classes on sustainability. Some are giving out degrees and courses. It's probably a year or two old. Given this historic time we are in, what should these people do? Academia is obviously very slow. It takes a lot of time to start something, and it takes even more time to kill something. So how should you pivot, change, respond? Is there a future for this kind of coursework and degrees?
Let me first say that we launched this degree program 2 months into this new administration, about 2 months after the normal time period for launching the programs because of a late certificate we needed from the state. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. More applicants to this program than to the other master's programs, huge interest from practitioners all over the world to teach, to be involved, and so on. Huge interest. So the first thing is that there is a hunger for this type of training in a rapidly evolving landscape. The second thing is that I think part of the reason for the interest, but also an imperative for educators, is to bring clarity to the confusion that exists in this landscape. Part of the reason people want to come, some want to solve problems, some want to understand what it means for investment decision-making. I think a lot of them want to know, what do we even mean by climate finance? Because we use that term very generally. So my goal with the program, which I would say we all should be doing as educators, is to bring clarity to confused landscapes, which, by the way, we have plenty of. So we are distinguishing, for instance, how climate change, with the implications of climate change for investment and business decision making, and what tools can be useful in that respect. How do we think about risk? How do we think about opportunity? How do we change our processes? Which is separate from how do we finance climate action at scale? What are the barriers? Where do we need climate finance? How do we understand sectoral opportunities or imperatives, regional distinctions, and so on? So let's bring clarity to what we're trying to achieve. And then in every class, and I'll end on this, in every class, I would not only teach the tools that exist and how we're approaching things, but let's encourage our students to think critically and analytically about the tools that we're teaching them and the frameworks that exist. Are these fit for purpose? Are there challenges? Are there questions that are coming up? What doesn't make sense? How might we do better? To me, that's the absolute joy of teaching and of universities, is we are the main place where we can be thinking differently about how we understand the tools and the imperatives of this landscape. And no better time than right now, because the world is attentive to this issue from many different directions. We absolutely need new approaches, whether it's to manage risk or to have impact. And so we really need a new generation of practitioners that will think differently about their own disciplines, their own interests, to figure out how to more rigorously contribute to new solutions. So I welcome anyone else teaching to be in touch and to think together about how we can best train the next generation of practitioners.
Thank you, Lisa. So interesting. We're out of time. To be continued. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shiva.